Alrighty, so this begins part 2 of the 3-part series of these ecology notes, and we're going to go right into populations. So, the growth curve. This shows how the population grows exponentially, and then it reaches a point where it caps off. So, there is no... The population stops growing, essentially, and it just stays steady for however long until it might either increases a bit, but that's mainly the basic idea of the growth curve. And there are 3 types of ways a population can be dispersed or spread out among an area. There's clumped dispersion, which refers to, I guess you could refer to how humans are living on Earth now with clumps, as in cities. Uniform dispersion, which can be seen with certain birds that migrate towards certain places and get a certain area of space to nest. And then random dispersion, which is also pretty common. You could also think of humans living on Earth as random dispersion. Survivorship. This can help describe the reproductive strategy of species. A survivorship curve is a diagram showing the number of surviving members over time from a measured set of births. They can be type 1, type 2, or type 3, and we're going to talk about what each one means. So type 1. This is the low level of infant mortality and an older population, common to large mammals and humans. Type 2 is the survivorship rate is equal to all stages of life. This is common to birds and reptiles. And then type 3 is a very high birth rate and a very high infant mortality, which is common among invertebrates and plants. An organism of 10 offspring, we'll say as an example. 2 of these offspring die each year over a 5-year period. Is this organism more likely to be a bird or an insect? We could think of this organism as a bird because its mortality pattern is described closest to type 2, which sort of has this steady linear decrease. Insects, again, tend to be type 3 with many offspring and high mortality early in life stages. So it's sort of going to take a dip down early rather than go and then drop. As when we're talking about birds, sort of that steady, as we said, linear decrease in this case. So energy flow. Sunlight is the main energy source for life on Earth, period. Heterotrophs are organisms that rely on other organisms for their food and supply, or food supply, also called consumers. Autotrophs are typically plants, and they're organisms which capture energy from sunlight or from chemical compounds to make energy. So, chemosynthesis. When an organism uses chemical energy to produce carbohydrates, this is known as chemosynthesis. Then we talk about photosynthesis, which is when an organism uses light energy to produce carbohydrates. So in one we're talking about chemical energy, and the other we're talking about light energy. So an example of chemosynthesis are bacteria in places like ocean vents, hot springs, deep ocean floors, whereas photosynthesis we can just think of general plants and bacteria and some protists. So these are the types of heterotrophs. Herbivores, which eat plants; carnivores, they eat meat; omnivores eat both; and decomposers, they break down organic matter, so they don't really have a preference. The food chain. This is a series of steps in which an organism transfers energy by eating or being eaten. And then the food web links all the food chains in the ecosystem, and it shows how certain organisms feed off each other and whatnot. So the trophic levels. Each step in a food chain or food web, and each food web and food chain have these. So these are the parts. We have producers and decomposers, first in the order as a consumer, or the herbivore, second order consumer, carnivore, and the third order consumer, which can range. Alright. So populations. As we talked about this earlier, the growth curve, typically referred to as an S-shaped curve, shows the population with limiting factors. Meanwhile, there's certain growth curves that are also referred to as J curves, which show the population growing without limiting factors, whereas as it goes up and then it caps, the J just continues to go up. So we think of the J curve as exponential, where it continues to go up, and the S curve as logistical, where they're limiting factors. So it goes and then it stops. And that's called logistical. Succession. These are changes in a community over time. All ecosystems go through succession. Ecological succession. There are two types of succession: primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession. This is when bare rock is broken down by lichens, lichens, and mosses to make soil. Weeds and grasses begin to grow in the small amount of soil. They add to organic matter as they die and are broken down by bacteria. Bushes and shrubs begin to grow as the soil deepens. The first trees and pines and hickories begin to form. This eventually grows into a mature forest or climax community over a long period of time. Secondary succession. This occurs after a community has been cleared because of a disturbance, whether it's natural or artificial. So this can range from a nuclear apocalypse in artificial terms or natural terms, as in a forest fire. This is when there is already existing soil, or there's a seed bank. Their root systems are undisturbed in the soil. The stumps and other plants from previously existing plants can rapidly regenerate, and the fertility and structure of the soil has also already been substantially modified by previous organisms to make it more suitable for growth and colonization. So we have primary succession, and then think about when the meteor hit, the one that killed the dinosaurs. Most of the world went through secondary succession, where it regrew out of that soil that was already sort of fertilized and perfected in primary succession. Ecological succession. There's the pioneer stage, which is the first stage. This is when the lichens, decomposers, mosses, ferns, grass, shrubs, animals, etc. And then we eventually get to the climax community, which is the dominant organisms maintain control over the ecosystem. We can think of North Georgia as a climax community in terms of like the oak trees in the hickory forest, or a pond, or landfills and pond. You can think of many other examples, I'm sure. So we talk about primary succession and then secondary succession, but how are they different? Primary succession begins with barren rock, worn down and colonized with a pioneer species. Secondary succession begins with established soil in which many different plants can grow. Why are pioneer species so important for primary succession? These are the mosses and lichens that break down rock into smaller pieces. When they die, their remains may mix with a piece of rock, forming a thin layer of soil. they change the ecosystem in ways that enable the support of more diverse species. Where does primary succession take longer? In tropical areas or Arctic areas? Primary succession takes longer in Arctic areas because the rock is covered with snow part of the year and the growing season is shorter. The cold temperatures allow for slow growth and decomposition. Soil takes much longer to form in this sense. Which reaches a climax community first, in area undergoing primary or secondary succession? Secondary succession takes less time to reach a stable climax because the soil is already there. We talked about secondary succession where everything just builds on top of whatever has been destroyed. It's almost like if you were going to build a shack with nothing versus a shack from an old shack, you would already have the materials from the old shack to build a new shack. Whereas if you were going to start to build a shack out of nothing, you'd have to go buy stuff from the store. And that's sort of the same concept that applies to secondary succession and primary succession when talking about which one takes longer to reach a climax community. Soil profile. Soil ecology is the study of interactions among soil organisms and between biotic and abiotic aspects of the soil environment. Soils are composed of inorganic particles made of small rock fragments and minerals, organic matter, living organisms, and pore spaces, which are the portion of the soil occupied by air and water. Many soil types differ from one another because they either have different proportions of these components, the components are arranged in different ways, or the inorganic particles have been affected in various ways by weathering, and have different sizes that are made up of different minerals. Biomes. So we talk about the levels of ecology, and we go from cell or chemical to cell to blah blah blah, and then we have an organism, population, community, ecosystem, and then a biome. So what is a biome? Now, there are many different types of biomes, whether it be a tropical rainforest, savanna, desert, grassland, taiga, but the basic term for a biome is a collection of ecosystems, essentially. So when we think of tundra, you have a bunch of different ecosystems mixed into one area, and that makes up the biome. Same thing as goes with the forest, the jungle, temperate grassland, deciduous forest, desert, savanna, etc. Right. So, yeah, that is going to end part 2 of the 3-part series. Stay tuned for part 3 of the Ecology Notes. This should be on PowerSchool, so if you need it, just go look there and you can follow along. But yeah, perfect.